Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Karen Saupe. Have you noticed that you have a lot more choices in what kind of mustard to buy than our parents had a few decades ago? That's one of the benefits of globalization, if you care about mustard. But how do we grow economies and help improve living conditions for one population without hurting another? Can it even be done? Our guest today is an economist who believes that our moral choices can help shape a world economy that benefits everyone. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is John Tiemstra of the Calvin College Economics Department, who studies the relationship between morality and economic life. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Karen.
Globalized trade has benefits potentially for everyone in the world, including a bigger marketplace leading to more opportunities for employment, more opportunities for consumption, more choices, lower prices.
Yes, that's the main thing we look for from it. We look for economic growth, economic development, particularly the kind of development that will pull up the poorest people in the world and bring them into what we think of as the middle class, what we call the middle class. And there's been some success at that in countries like South Korea and China and India.
So potentially this is an everybody wins situation.
Well, it could be, but that doesn't happen automatically.
Okay. One of the opportunities is the idea of trickle down, that higher wages and rising middle class in places like India and China can occur because as economic growth occurs in the United States, more jobs are created in those countries. Is that correct?
Where growth comes from is that there's more and more specialization, that people specialize in things that they're relatively good at, and they trade with people who specialize in different things. And that enables people, as people specialize in finer and finer, narrower and narrower areas, we get economic growth that way. Now, the problem is that when the change occurs, when we open up trade with other countries, especially with countries that have a lot of less skilled labor, our less skilled labor ends up competing with their less skilled labor. And so there can be a decline in employment among those folks and a decline in their wages.
So in the United States, we lose those low-end jobs to third world countries. So the argument gets made then that in their place, United States workers are able to train for higher level jobs, maybe more interesting, more satisfying jobs. Does that occur in fact?
Well, in the long run, it can work out that way. But in the short run, you have people who end up being displaced and who never regain the levels of wages that they saw before.
Okay. And there are a lot of kinds of globalization. We're talking here about globalized trade.
Right.
And you make a clear distinction between the trading of stocks and bonds and the trading of mustard and chocolate.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why is that different?
With financial markets, you have this possibility of instability, which, we got a warning of that in 97, 98, and then we had the full-blown crisis a couple of years ago. And that's always a possibility, and when you have globalized financial markets, those things tend to spread. It also tends to focus on these strictly financial criteria for businesses. When you're investing in a foreign company, what do you know about them? What do you know about their environmental practices? What do you know about their labor practices? What do you know about their attitude toward their community or their support for cultural life in their community? Nothing. What do you know? You know how much they made. You know how much money they made. So you tend to focus on that. And I think it's much better if we invest in companies that are closer to home and that therefore we know better, instead of focusing strictly on financial criteria. We know something about a company's reputation.
So you seem to be saying buy globally and invest locally. Okay.
And there are a lot of economists who make a sharp distinction there and say trading in goods and services has a lot of potential for enhancing economic growth and helping out poor folks, especially in developing countries. trade in stocks and bonds, while it was originally thought to be a promising thing, has not worked out the way we hoped it would. And there are a lot of economists who say that that doesn't have the same advantages that trade in goods and services does.
Okay. Can you give me maybe just a little narrative about someone in, say, South Korea who is benefiting from globalization, an average worker? What happens to his life as he maybe gets a factory job producing goods that are going to be sold overseas?
Well, South Korea 60 years ago was the South Korea you see in the MASH reruns, you know, with people doing subsistence farming and living under very poor conditions. South Korea today is a country that resembles the United States in a lot of ways. And part of that is because now we have South Korean cars. We have Kias and Hyundais on our streets. And so we have South Koreans who are working at the kinds of factory jobs that people in Detroit were working at 50, 60 years ago.
And so along with that comes the financial benefits of working. What about cultural changes for them?
A lot of people worry that as international trade occurs, it's not just cars and agricultural products and things like that, but it's also books and movies and music and things of that sort, cultural products. And I think that's a genuine concern. People worry about their national culture being overwhelmed by Hollywood. I also worry about another kind of cultural homogenization that might be going on, and that has to do with business practices. In Asian countries in particular, in countries that are traditionally Islamic, business is done in a different way than it is here.
Tell me about that.
They handle things differently. Well, for instance, in our country, we like to think that when people have a good idea for a business, they can go to a bank or they can go to a venture capital firm or something like that, and they can get financing for it on the basis of the strength of the idea. In a lot of other cultures, you have to know somebody. You have to have connections. You have to be part of a group. And whether or not you get financing depends on those personal connections. Now, there are reasons for that. And that's a way of handling a problem in financial markets that we economists worry about called asymmetric information. But the advantage of our system is that you don't have to be connected.
Right, everyone has a chance.
Everybody has a chance. In Asian systems, the advantage is they're not constantly suing each other, which we are, and they don't have as many lawyers, and they don't spend as much time in court.
So sort of their homework is done up front, that if you know someone and you trust them, that's because they've already established a reputation.
Yeah. Well, and if they do something to you, you can get back at them in a lot of different ways.
Because you've got connections.
You've got connections.
It sounds a little like the mafia, but...
Well, I mean, you're not going to have them over for Easter dinner, you know, or something like that.
Okay. But let's say I'm a young Asian person with a great idea and no connections. How will I ever have the chance to prove myself? And isn't that where the Western methods give me the advantage?
That's the disadvantage.
Yeah.
Is that a person like that is kind of stuck.
Okay. So maybe we get the best of both worlds and we get the worst of both worlds as different forces combine or interact.
There's a tendency for Americans to think that our way of doing things is the best way of doing things, and we want to impose it on the rest of the world.
So we tend to be steamrolling.
And when we integrate financial markets like that, when we integrate the markets for loans, stocks and bonds and things like that, we tend to say, okay, you all have to do it our way. And this creates resentment of our power. It creates, and it creates cultural problems. They say our religion teaches us that we can't charge interest and so on and so forth. One of the disadvantages of globalized markets for stocks and bonds is that they don't allow that diversity in the ways of handling these problems.
Are there examples where they do? Are there examples where other cultures have infiltrated American practices by means of globalized trade? I'm thinking a while back, I remember reading about, I think, Japanese business practices and how those could be employed in the United States to the benefit of all, that companies could start operating differently. Are there many examples of that sort of thing happening, or does Western culture tend to take the lead?
We have trouble learning from from other folks. You know, General Motors years ago had a joint venture with Toyota in California that was called NUMMI in Fremont, California, in an old GM plant. And GM was going to learn how to make small cars from the Japanese, learn how to do it profitably. NUMMI did fine, but the lessons from that plant never got transferred to the rest of GM, which is one of the reasons GM ended up in trouble. So, and that's partly a product of GM's size and bureaucracy, but it's partly the difficulty Americans have with absorbing those kinds of lessons.
But we do get benefits. I can go pick out 12 different kinds of mustard at the grocery store now, where I couldn't do that 10 or 20 years ago. And presumably then I can acquire new tastes as a result of those opportunities.
Yeah, and you can get grapes year-round and all that kind of thing, yeah.
And there are shared technological advances. I would think that a big advantage of globalization is that we don't have to rely only on American minds to figure out how to create the next energy source or how to run the next TV set, but we've got all the minds in all the world working together.
Yes, that helps. And that's a particular benefit for the developing countries where there is a lot they can learn about manufacturing technology, for instance, from our experience.
The Pew Global Attitudes Project did a survey in which they surveyed people from several countries, and the majority of those people saw benefit from trade connections, that it's widely agreed that in many ways globalized trade is a very good thing. And it's also, that study also shows that most of the people surveyed want their environment protected as well. Is that what happens, or do global economies seem to be sort of mining natural resources and using them up and looking for the next thing?
There's a tendency for businesses to want to minimize environmental regulation on them. It's a constraint on the way they operate. It can be expensive.
Sure.
So some of them for whom environmental issues are really important end up doing this thing where they play off one country against another and say, well, if you don't regulate us, we'll go to your country instead of staying in the U.S. or whatever.
Because we can produce our goods less expensively by not having to.
You even get that among American states sometimes. That happens here too. Now the question is that going to lead to a situation where we have a race to the bottom in environmental standards, where everybody ends up with the lowest common denominator because that's the only way you can attract businesses, the only way you can attract investment and jobs? Where in order to counteract that, it's important for governments to work together and for environmental activist organizations in the private sector, civil society organizations, if you will, to work together too, to make sure that that sort of thing doesn't happen, so that you can't play off one country against another in that way. And it's important too that the leaders of all three of those sectors, business, government, and civil society, make it clear what the environmental goals are going to be and what we expect those standards to be. And where there's that kind of agreement and that kind of articulation, it can work very well. I mean, if you look at the Montreal Protocol, which controlled the ozone depleting chemicals, that worked out very well. The governments agreed on it. The environmental organizations pushed for it. The businesses bought into it, because they said, well, you know, we're still going to have aerosol propellants, we're still going to have refrigerants, and we're going to find a way to make environmentally compatible ones.
Not all of them, but I have this sort of cartoonish image of the head of major corporations wanting just more and more money, and I'll do whatever it takes to get it, and I'm going to grow so fast and so powerfully that my tentacles will reach all the world, and government and civil organizations won't have the power to counteract that because I have all the money. That's
the worry. And you see that sometimes. I mean, I recently saw an interview on television with the head of Cisco Systems who was saying, oh, well, you know, corporate income taxes in the U.S. are too high, and that's forcing us to go overseas.
Right.
And so we have to lower the corporate income tax in America. And well, you know, that's a company that has a lot of market power. Now, taxes are important to them because they don't have any other factors that are pushing them toward one location or another. No big natural resource issues, no big issues of we have to be close to our customers or whatever.
So they really can let money be the bottom line.
So taxes figure big in their location decisions. That's not true for every industry. But to have him going on television and making this case, you know, you and I don't get to go on television and make, well, we are on television. We might make the case that, well, we need some revenue to take care of this budget deficit we have. And maybe governments ought to get together and agree on sort of the range within which they're going to have these taxes. The government of Ireland has attracted a lot of businesses because its corporate income tax rate is very low, 12.5%. Ireland also has a big budget problem right now, and they're getting pressure from the rest of the European Union to raise that.
So they can pay their bills.
So they can pay their bills. And, you know, if we cut that rate, we run the risk of going down the road Ireland went down.
So what's to motivate a corporation like Cisco to stay or to pay higher taxes, or to say, our primary concern as a corporation is not maximizing profits? Is that ever true of a corporation?
Yeah, it is. Corporations have lots of goals. Profit is one of them. It's always one of them.
Sure.
And it's a big one. But they're also interested in the communities in which they operate. They're also interested in having a good reputation. They're interested in political influence. They're interested in the well-being of their workers, we hope. They're interested in helping their customers solve problems. Cisco Systems has some competition in the world, but not enough that they're forced to set their price at a certain competitive level because it's a perfectly competitive market, and if they raise it a penny, everybody's going to go to somebody else. So they have enough market power to say, look, we can stay in the United States and be good American citizens. We can treat our workers well. We can treat the environment well, and we can make money. And we just have to find a price where we can do that.
So one of the arguments about globalization is this trickle-down effect that, as we've discussed earlier, as more jobs are created, more opportunities occur. But then we hear images of people in third world countries going to work in sweatshops and maybe sending home the money so their family can have a better life. Is that really a better life?
For a lot of them it is. For a lot of them, life in the traditional sector of the economy is really precarious. They don't really have enough to do, and their life is very much at the mercy of weather and natural conditions, and what the big landowners decide to do, and things like that. So for a lot of them, it does represent a better life, and that's why they choose it. There are also ways of establishing minimum levels of well-being for workers, minimum standards for labor, and there again, what you need is leadership by the labor organizations, by the international labor organizations, and the churches and other groups like that are concerned about such matters. Also, agreements among governments. With labor, that's harder to do than it is with the environment. With labor, but there have been successes. There have been successes with child labor. We do have international agreements covering child labor. We have international agreements covering prison labor. In some trade agreements, there are, for instance, the North American Free Trade Agreement has provisions covering the rights of unions and the ability of people to organize and bargain collectively. Now, enforcing that hasn't gone as well as it has with environmental issues, and the agreements are harder to reach. And you're never going to see an agreement on a global minimum wage or something like that. But there's opportunity for I think more work to be done in that area.
So if I'm living in Tanzania and a company comes in and gives me a job and my life's better than it was, but it's still awful, is like, do you start with very low standards and slowly increase them, or do you try to jump to you know, an American standard of living right away. As corporations or civil societies seek to put pressure and create legislation that's going to protect workers, should we set the bar low at first, or go for the top?
Well, that's an area where I think countries have to be able to make their own choices based on their own conditions and their own needs and their own culture. So there has to be some room for countries to write their own regulations in those areas. But this is an area where you can have international organizations that are interested in worker safety and health and worker rights and things like that, who can go around the world, and academics do this too, can go around the world and point to conditions and say, you know, this is really bad and it could be better without too much difficulty, and hold that up to public scrutiny and hold the employers accountable.
So part of what globalization can do is make us increasingly aware of what's happening in other countries. I mean, I find this overwhelming sometimes to hear the news from all over the world and think, where do you even begin? But the fact that I can influence corporations a little bit as a consumer gives me just a little bit of power over what happens in other countries.
Yeah, as a consumer, a very little bit of power. But you know, when you think about those civil society organizations, or even when you think about the academic world, I mean, Michael Novak calls this the moral cultural sector of society, right? The churches, the journalists, the activist organizations, the academics.
Who are maybe trying to be the conscience of the world?
Who are maybe trying to be the conscience. And who have an awful lot of difficulty cooperating internationally, as governments often do. But if we can cooperate internationally, and if we can work together, we can hold a lot of these things up to public scrutiny, and we can propose ideas about how things could become better. And that can move the governments, and that can move the businesses too.
Do you think boycotts are effective when groups call for product boycotts?
Not very. When you have a boycott, it's not the withdrawal of business that actually makes a difference. It's the publicity that makes the difference.
So it's about public image.
It's about public image. It's about saying, here's a situation that we think is really bad and needs to be changed, and getting public attention for that.
What concerns you most personally, John, as you look over things like what's a cause or one or two causes that you want to put your energy into changing or shaping or influencing?
Well, I'm really concerned about the climate change issue. The fact that the United States, you know, the United States signed on to the Rio Agreement in '92, which set out the framework for dealing with climate change. Since then, we have not been in the leadership on that issue. And without our leadership, not very much is going to happen. I think the environmental activist organizations are involved in this and keeping it in front of the public. The churches are beginning to get involved in it, religious people. But our government doesn't seem to want to move on it, and that's very disappointing to me, and I think we need to keep working on that. And energy goes along with that. I mean, we talk about developing more oil resources, developing more natural gas resources. The day is going to come when we won't be able to afford to burn those things, not because they'll be so expensive, although they will be, but because we can't afford to put all that carbon in the atmosphere.
You've put forth in your scholarship an optimistic view that I really appreciate, that says corporations and organizations do have choices. As you were talking about Cisco, it's not a matter of we have no choice but to move our operations to another country. There's always a choice.
Right.
Tell me about some corporations and maybe some countries who have made wise choices and who we should look to as models. California, with emission standards and so forth.
Well, there it's the government again that's made the choice.
But without federal regulations, they've decided on their own. Why and how?
Well, one of the things that can give a government power is large size, right? I mean, this is true of corporations too. Big corporations have power. Big governments have power. Big countries. And California is a big market. It's, what, 1/8 of the U.S. economy or something like that. And there are a lot of companies in the world who feel like they can't afford to be shut out of the California market. California state government knows that, and so they push very hard on environmental issues in particular. And we all end up benefiting from it because we all end up with cars that meet California emission standards, even though they don't have to in other parts of the country necessarily. And so that's and that's part of what has given the United States power. No corporation, no business in the world wants to be shut out of the U.S. market, and that gives us some power to say, okay, but then you have to meet our standards. But we're shrinking, relatively speaking. We're going to be a smaller and smaller part of the world economy as places like China and India and Brazil and Russia grow. So we've got to use that power while we still have it, because we're not going to have it forever.
Thank you. My guest today is John Tiemstra of the Calvin College Economics Department, who studies the relationship between morality and economic life. Thank you, John.
You're welcome,
Thank
Karen.
you for watching Inner Compass.